Well, that's a very good point that you brought up, because Citibank going forward is going to be a very different institution, even right down to the people in it, basically. So you are talking about a deconstruct, a fracture, in the process by which they go forward. And that's something that you don't really deal with or think about too much, because you seem to think a lot in a linear sort of fashion. Like if you want to build an idea, this is how you build. But very often in business, there are fractures. There are points at which there are inflection points which takes it in a different direction almost. Do you think a lot about that, or do you give some thought to inflection points rather than spark plug points where the opportunity actually grows further?
Well, that was the sort of my first book, The Tipping Point, was really a kind of, I was very interested in that phenomenon. A tipping point or an inflection point is gains that status, we call it that, when there is a kind of clear delineation, a change in state, when there is a moment when a phenomenon moves from being one way to being another way. And that, in many cases, is a very positive step.
Yeah, that's a positive thing, yeah.
And my argument with the financial crisis would be, we were presented with the opportunity for an inflection point, and I worry that we didn't make the most of it.
Exactly.
So, I mean, looking at, to go back to the example of Citigroup, Citigroup should have been broken into 100 pieces. And, I know that they are slowly in the process of selling off assets and restructuring themselves, but I'm not sure that what was the fault with that was a deeply held institutional culture. The difference at the end of the day between Goldman or Credit Suisse or Deutsche Bank or any of the successful ones and the unsuccessful ones was not simply a matter of whether they had a far-flung, badly integrated set of divisions. It had to do with a fundamental corporate culture. And my question is the kind of revamping of Citigroup that's going on right now going to change that fundamental culture, or is it simply going to change the exterior form of the corporate body? And I want some assurance that there is a radical transformation in that culture, that it really emerges in a different state fundamentally than it came into the crisis.
Are your ideas applicable to the way in which information evolves as opposed to behavior or trends? One of the interesting things about the current crisis, or the crisis we've just gone through, is that this concept of the availability of information, or the asymmetry of information, is not necessarily true. Especially in closed markets, especially in the OTCs, for example, some people have more information and they deliberately do not pass that on to other players so that they can trade on an even keel. It seems to me that it's something that does not come out very clearly in your book, which is what needs to happen with information in order for there to be the trends that you talk about? Or are you making an assumption that information is symmetric?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, it's interesting. It's a really interesting question. It's not something that I have dealt with in my books, more so in some of my writing.
And I asked that question because it seems to be very important to financial markets.
Yeah.
And it might be important to any sort of industry where information, the technology industry, for example.
Yeah. Well, I wrote, it's funny, when Enron collapsed a few years back, which I think in retrospect that was the great portent of what happened. It was the lesson that we didn't learn. I wrote a long story at Enron because I was fascinated by one fact about that collapse, which was the journalist who really kind of broke the story, and also the short sellers who started the initial run. They found out about Enron's perilous position by reading Enron's own financial disclosures. There was no secret document. There was no buried piece of information that came to light through nefarious means. It was literally the case that the journalists involved, a guy for the Wall Street Journal, and the key short sellers, downloaded from the internet, like anyone could, the 10Ks and 10Qs and whatever of Enron, and actually took the time to read them. And the incredible thing about that is that clearly no one had done that to that point. Right? Everyone had just taken Enron at its word, that, oh, they're an innovative, great company. And no one had taken the time to actually read what Enron itself was telling us, right? So that said to me that it wasn't that there was an asymmetry in the availability of information. There was an asymmetry in the willingness of individuals to absorb the information. That was the unlearned lesson from Enron that could have helped us in this current crisis, which was, look, the world is really complicated now, and it requires gatekeepers to take their job of understanding complexity a lot more seriously, and people did.